The year was 1943, and the world was burning. While millions of men marched off to war, women were told to stay home, tend gardens, and roll bandages.
The sky belonged to men, they said. Flying a fighter jet into combat?
Impossible. Too dangerous. Too complicated. Women's hands weren't strong enough, their nerves not steady enough, their minds not sharp enough for the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death at 400 miles per hour.
But in a small airfield outside Moscow, a young woman named Lydia Litviak was about to prove the entire world wrong. She would become the first woman in history to shoot down an enemy aircraft, and before her story ended, she would claim 12 confirmed kills, earn the nickname the White Rose of Stalingrad, and show the world that courage has no gender.
This is the story of how a 21-year-old woman defied an empire, rewrote the rules of aerial combat, and paid the ultimate price for proving that the sky belongs to anyone brave enough to claim it. Her blood would stain the cockpit, her aircraft would limp home riddled with bullets, but her victory would echo through history forever.
They told her she couldn't fly. She responded by becoming one of the deadliest pilots in aviation history.
Lydia Vladimirovna Litviak was born into a world that had already decided her limitations before she took her first breath. The year was 1921, and Russia was still bleeding from revolution and civil war. In the small town where she grew up, girls were expected to learn cooking, sewing, and childcare. The sky above was for dreaming, not for conquering. But Lydia was different from the moment she could walk. While other children played with dolls and wooden toys, she would lie in the grass for hours, watching the occasional aircraft cross the vast Russian sky. Her eyes would track every movement, memorizing the way the wings caught the sunlight, the sound of engines growing louder then fading into the distance. Her mother would call her inside for meals, but Lydia's mind remained somewhere up there, dancing through the clouds. When she turned 14, something extraordinary happened. The Soviet government announced new programs to train young people in aviation skills. It was 1935, and Stalin's regime was preparing for the war everyone knew was coming. They needed pilots, mechanics, and aviation specialists. For the first time in Russian history, they were willing to consider training women. Most girls Lydia's age were thinking about boys, fashion, and their future families.
Lydia was thinking about flight patterns and engine mechanics when the local flying club announced they would accept female applicants. She was first in line.
Her parents were horrified. Flying was dangerous enough for men, they argued. For a young woman, it was madness. But Lydia had inherited her father's stubborn streak and her mother's fierce determination. She worked extra jobs after school, saved every kopeck, and convinced her parents that this was not a passing fancy. This was her calling. The flying club reluctantly accepted her application, more out of curiosity than confidence.
They had never trained a woman before, and most of the instructors privately believed she would wash out within weeks. Her first flight changed everything.
The instructor, a grizzled veteran named Pavel, who had fought in the First World War, expected to see terror or confusion in the young woman's eyes as they climbed into the training aircraft. Instead, he saw something that reminded him of the best pilots he had ever known: absolute focus and natural understanding. As the small biplane lifted off from the grass airfield, Lydia felt something click into place in her soul. The ground fell away beneath them, and suddenly she was where she belonged. The controls felt natural in her hands. The movement of the aircraft through the air made perfect sense. And the view from above showed her a world she had always known existed but never been able to see. Pavel later told other instructors that he had never seen a student take to flying with such immediate instinct. Most new pilots were tense, overwhelmed by the sensation of leaving the ground. Lydia was relaxed, asking intelligent questions, already thinking ahead to more complex maneuvers. By the time they landed, Pavel knew he was training someone special. The other male students at the flying club initially treated Lydia as a curiosity, then as a joke. They made crude comments about women belonging in kitchens, not cockpits. They placed bets on how long she would last before crying and quitting. Some tried to sabotage her equipment or spread rumors that she was sleeping with instructors to get better treatment. Lydia's response was simple and devastating. She outflew them all. While they struggled with basic maneuvers, she was mastering advanced techniques. While they crashed during practice landings, she set her aircraft down with the precision of a surgeon. Within 6 months, she had earned her pilot's license and was teaching other students the skills they couldn't master themselves. Word of the extraordinary young pilot began to spread beyond their small flying club. In Moscow, aviation officials were taking note of reports about a woman who could fly better than most men.
This was the era of Soviet propaganda celebrating female achievement, and Lydia represented something powerful. Proof that Soviet training could create exceptional aviators regardless of gender. In 1937, she was invited to join an advanced training program at a prestigious aviation school. This was an unprecedented opportunity, but it came with enormous pressure. She would be the only woman among hundreds of male students under constant scrutiny, representing not just herself, but the possibility that women could excel in aviation. The advanced training was brutally difficult. Students learned aerobatics, formation flying, night navigation, and emergency procedures.
Many washed out within the first month. The physical demands were enormous. Pulling G-forces during tight turns, maintaining consciousness during complex maneuvers, developing the split-second reflexes needed for precision flying. Lydia not only survived the program but excelled beyond everyone's expectations. Her instructors noted that she had an almost supernatural ability to read weather conditions, predict aircraft behavior, and maintain perfect control even in dangerous situations. She could perform aerobatic sequences that left other students dizzy and confused, and her precision in formation flying was so exact that other pilots used her as a reference point. But success came with a price.
The constant pressure of representing all women in aviation wore on her mentally and emotionally. She had no female peers to share experiences with, no one who understood the unique challenges she faced.
Male students either resented her achievements or treated her like an exotic pet rather than an equal colleague. The stress manifested in different ways. She developed insomnia, lying awake at night replaying every flight, analyzing every mistake, worrying about whether tomorrow would be the day she failed, and proved all the skeptics right. She lost weight from nervous energy and irregular eating. Her letters home became shorter and more distant as she struggled to explain her experiences to family who couldn't understand them. Despite these challenges, Lydia graduated at the top of her class in 1938. She was now a certified advanced pilot with qualifications that opened doors to possibilities she had only dreamed of as a child watching aircraft cross the sky above her hometown. The Soviet aviation authorities offered her positions as a test pilot, flight instructor, or transport pilot, all prestigious roles that would have satisfied most aviators. But Lydia wanted more. She had heard rumors about experimental programs training combat pilots, preparing for the war everyone knew was approaching. The idea of aerial combat both terrified and thrilled her. It represented the ultimate test of everything she had learned, the highest level of aviation skill, and the chance to serve her country in the most meaningful way possible. When she applied for combat pilot training, the response was immediate and unanimous. Absolutely not. Combat flying was too dangerous, too physically demanding, too psychologically brutal for women. The aircraft were too powerful, the missions too complex, the stakes too high. She should be grateful for the opportunities she had already been given and accept a safe, respectable position as a civilian pilot. Lydia's response was to begin training herself. She studied combat tactics, practiced aggressive maneuvers, and pushed her aircraft to performance limits that worried her instructors. She developed her own theories about aerial combat, based on her understanding of aircraft capabilities and her analysis of reports from the Spanish Civil War where Soviet pilots were gaining combat experience. Her unofficial combat training caught the attention of Marina Roskova, a famous Soviet aviator who was quietly working with military officials to develop women's combat units. Roskova had been watching Lydia's progress for years and recognized her potential. In late 1941, as German forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory and the need for pilots became desperate, Roskova convinced military leadership to authorize an experimental program training women for combat roles. When the invitation came, Lydia didn't hesitate. She was 20 years old, had been flying for 6 years, and was about to become part of something unprecedented in military history, an all-female combat aviation regiment. The program would be grueling, dangerous, and quite possibly fatal. Many of the women who entered training would never return, but for Lydia, it represented the fulfillment of everything she had worked towards since that first flight at 14. She was going to war, flying the most advanced aircraft the Soviet Union could provide, facing the most skilled enemy pilots in the world. Everything she had learned, every hour of training, every moment of doubt and determination had been leading to this. As she packed her few belongings and prepared to report to the secret training facility, Lydia looked up at the sky one more time as a civilian pilot. The next time she flew, she would be a warrior, carrying weapons instead of passengers, hunting enemies instead of navigating peaceful routes.
The transition would test every skill she possessed and demand capabilities she had never needed before. The young woman who had once been told that the sky was no place for females was about to become one of the most feared combat pilots in aviation history. Her journey from curious child to accomplished aviator was ending, and her transformation into a legendary fighter pilot was about to begin. The secret training facility hidden in the forests outside Engels was unlike anything Lydia had ever experienced. Surrounded by tall fences and armed guards, it looked more like a prison camp than an aviation school. The buildings were hastily constructed wooden barracks with paper-thin walls that offered no protection from the brutal Russian winter. Ice formed on the inside of windows, and the women slept fully dressed under multiple blankets, their breath visible in the freezing air. Marina Raskova had assembled 400 women from across the Soviet Union for this unprecedented experiment. They came from every background imaginable: factory workers, teachers, university students, farm girls, and experienced civilian pilots like Lydia. What they shared was an absolute determination to prove themselves worthy of combat roles and a willingness to endure whatever hardships necessary to earn that opportunity. The training regimen was designed to break them. Military officials secretly hoped most would quit, providing justification for excluding women from combat roles permanently. The daily schedule began at 4 a.m. with brutal physical conditioning, running in heavy boots through snow, climbing obstacle courses with full equipment, performing endless calisthenics until muscles screamed in protest. Many women collapsed from exhaustion in the first weeks, and several were hospitalized with injuries or illness. But the physical training was only the beginning. Combat aviation required skills far beyond what civilian pilots ever developed. They learned weapons systems, studying the ballistics of aircraft-mounted guns, and the devastating power of various ammunition types. They memorized enemy aircraft silhouettes until they could identify German fighters and bombers from impossible distances and angles. They practiced aerial gunnery on towed targets, learning to calculate lead times and trajectory compensations, while pulling G-forces that made thinking clearly almost impossible. Navigation training pushed them beyond anything civilian aviation demanded. Combat pilots needed to find targets deep in enemy territory, often in bad weather with limited visibility, using only basic instruments in dead reckoning. They learned to read terrain features, follow railroad tracks and rivers, and estimate positions based on time and heading when landmarks disappeared. Getting lost in combat meant death, either from enemy fighters or from running out of fuel over hostile territory. Formation flying became a matter of life and death, rather than an impressive demonstration. Combat formations required aircraft to fly within feet of each other at high speeds, maintaining precise positions while scanning for enemies, communicating through hand signals, and preparing to break into evasive maneuvers instantly. A pilot who couldn't hold formation endangered the entire group, creating gaps that enemy fighters could exploit. Lydia excelled at every aspect of training, but the transition from civilian to military flying was more challenging than she had anticipated. Civilian aircraft were forgiving. They responded gradually to control inputs and provided plenty of warning before reaching dangerous conditions. Military fighters were unforgiving machines that could kill inexperienced pilots in seconds. They accelerated and climbed at rates that caused blackouts, turned so tightly that structural limits could be exceeded, and carried ammunition that could explode if handled incorrectly. Her first flight in a combat aircraft was both exhilarating and terrifying. The Yakovlev Yak. One fighter was a beautiful machine, sleek, powerful, and deadly. The engine produced 3 times the power of civilian aircraft she had flown, and the acceleration pressed her back into the seat with force she had never experienced. The controls were incredibly sensitive, responding to the slightest pressure with immediate and dramatic results. But it was also temperamental and dangerous. The Yak-1 had a tendency to enter unrecoverable spins if mishandled. Its landing gear collapsed frequently, and the engine had a disturbing habit of catching fire at high altitudes. Several women were killed during training when their aircraft malfunctioned, and others barely survived emergency landings in aircraft that came apart around them. The psychological pressure was enormous. Unlike civilian flying, where mistakes meant embarrassment or minor damage, combat training mistakes could be fatal. Every flight carried real danger, every maneuver had life-or-death consequences, and every error was analyzed ruthlessly by instructors looking for weaknesses that could prove fatal in actual combat. Lydia developed a reputation among instructors as someone who thrived under pressure rather than being crushed by it. While other students became increasingly tense and cautious as training progressed, she became more confident and aggressive. She pushed her aircraft to performance limits that worried even experienced combat pilots, but she always maintained control and made sound tactical decisions. Her fellow trainees had mixed reactions to Lydia's abilities. Some admired her skill and looked to her as an inspiration, proof that women could excel at the most demanding aviation roles. Others resented her success,
feeling that her achievements made their own struggles more obvious.
Few accused her of showing off or taking unnecessary risks that endangered others. The truth was more complex.
That truth is always on the badge.
Lydia had discovered something about herself during training. She was genuinely suited for combat aviation in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. The combination of technical skill, physical capability, and psychological resilience required for aerial combat came naturally to her.
While other pilots had to work hard to develop these qualities, she seemed to possess them instinctively. But this natural ability came with a dark side, the same qualities that made her an exceptional combat pilot. Aggression, competitiveness, willingness to take risks, were changing her personality in ways that concerned those who knew her best.
Letters from home went unanswered for weeks. She became increasingly distant from other women in the program, and she began displaying the cold, calculating mindset that combat pilots needed to survive, but that isolated them from normal human relationships. Training intensified as winter progressed into spring.
They learned air-to-air combat techniques, practicing dogfighting maneuvers that required split-second timing and absolute precision. Mock combat exercises pitted them against experienced male pilots flying captured German aircraft, providing realistic training against actual enemy tactics and capabilities.
These exercises revealed the brutal reality of aerial combat. Success required not just technical flying skills but also ruthless aggression and the ability to kill other human beings without hesitation.
Many women struggled with this psychological transition, finding it difficult to shift from protecting life to taking it. Some washed out of the program at this stage, realizing they could not make the mental adjustment combat required.
Lydia had no such difficulties. During mock combat, she displayed an intuitive understanding of fighter tactics and a willingness to press attacks even when outnumbered or at a disadvantage.
Her instructors noted that she seemed to anticipate enemy movements, positioning her aircraft perfectly for killing shots and evading counterattacks with movements that appeared almost supernatural. Weapons training revealed another dimension of her abilities.
Aerial gunnery required a unique combination of pilot skill and marksmanship, calculating bullet trajectories while flying at high speed through three-dimensional space. Most pilots needed hundreds of hours of practice to develop reasonable accuracy. Lydia achieved expert-level gunnery scores within weeks, demonstrating the kind of natural shooting ability that instructors had rarely seen.
As spring turned to summer, the training program neared completion. German forces were advancing deeper into Soviet territory, and the need for every available pilot was becoming desperate.
The women had been isolated from news of the war's progress, but they could see the increasing urgency in their instructors' attitudes and the frequency of aircraft flying overhead toward the front lines. Final evaluations determined which women would be assigned to combat units and which would be relegated to transport or training roles. The tests covered every aspect of their training: technical flying skills, weapons proficiency, navigation accuracy, formation flying, and psychological readiness for combat. Only the highest-scoring candidates would be trusted with frontline combat missions.
Lydia's evaluation scores were unprecedented. She achieved perfect or near-perfect marks in every category, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded many experienced male combat pilots.
Her instructors recommended her for immediate assignment to an active combat squadron with the notation that she possessed exceptional combat potential and should be given opportunities to develop her skills against actual enemy aircraft. But the recommendation came with warnings. Lydia's instructors recognized that her exceptional abilities were paired with personality traits that could prove problematic. She was increasingly isolated, emotionally distant, and displayed signs of the obsessive perfectionism that could lead combat pilots to take unnecessary risks in pursuit of victory. They worried that her confidence might cross the line into overconfidence, leading to tactical mistakes that could prove fatal. The final graduation ceremony was held on a beautiful summer morning in 1942. Of the 400 women who had begun training, fewer than 200 remained. The others had been eliminated by injury, illness, inability to master required skills, or psychological breakdowns under the enormous pressure. Those who remained represented the first generation of female combat pilots in aviation history.
Lydia received assignment to the 437th Fighter Aviation Regiment, an elite unit equipped with the latest aircraft and staffed by experienced pilots. She would be flying Yak-1
fighters in support of ground operations along the southern front where German forces were pushing toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. The missions would be dangerous, the enemy experienced and well-equipped, and the margin for error non-existent. As she packed her few belongings for transport to the front, Lydia reflected on the transformation she had undergone. 9 months earlier, she had been a civilian pilot with dreams of combat flying. Now she was a trained killer, equipped with skills and weapons to engage the most advanced air force in the world. The shy young woman who had once lain in grass watching aircraft pass overhead had become something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Her fellow graduates were experiencing similar reflections. They had volunteered to prove that women could serve their country as effectively as men, but the training had changed them in ways they had not anticipated. They were no longer the daughters, sisters, and sweethearts they had been before. They were warriors, shaped by months of brutal preparation for a conflict that would test every skill they had learned and demand sacrifices they could not yet imagine. The transport truck that would carry them to the front arrived at dawn. As Lydia climbed aboard with her gear and weapons, she looked back once at the training facility that had transformed her life. She would never return as the same person who had arrived 9 months earlier. The war ahead would complete her transformation from exceptional pilot to legendary fighter, but it would also test whether her humanity could survive the demands of aerial combat. The 437th Fighter Aviation Regiment's airfield was a collection of tents, wooden buildings, and aircraft revetments carved from the steppes near Stalingrad in the summer of 1942. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with dust and smoke from distant battles created an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. Mechanics worked frantically to keep fighters operational while pilots grabbed sleep between missions and radio operators tracked the movements of massive German formations advancing toward the city. When Lydia arrived with her transport of newly graduated female pilots, the reaction from veteran male pilots was immediate and hostile.
These men had been fighting for over a year, losing friends weekly to enemy action and mechanical failures. They had no patience for what they saw as a publicity stunt that might get them killed. The presence of women in a combat unit violated everything they understood about military tradition and operational effectiveness. Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Lavrinenko, the squadron's deputy commander, made his feelings clear during the newcomers' briefing. He was a decorated pilot with 15 confirmed kills, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a crash landing, and absolutely convinced that women had no place in aerial combat. His welcoming speech was brutal and direct. He expected the women to wash out quickly and return to safer assignments before their inexperience endangered experienced pilots. The male pilots' hostility manifested in numerous ways designed to force the women to quit. Essential equipment mysteriously disappeared from their quarters. Flight schedules were changed without notification, and mechanical problems with their aircraft took longer to repair than similar issues with male pilots' fighters. During briefings, their questions were ignored or answered with condescending explanations that assumed complete ignorance of combat procedures. Lydia's response was characteristically direct. Rather than complaining or seeking protection from superior officers, she focused on demonstrating her capabilities through performance. She volunteered for the most dangerous missions, spent extra hours studying enemy tactics and aircraft capabilities, and maintained her equipment with obsessive attention to detail that put many veterans to shame. Her first combat mission came 3 days after arriving at the regiment. German bombers were attacking a railway junction vital to Soviet supply lines, escorted by experienced Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters piloted by veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. The mission briefing was routine: intercept the bombers, avoid engagement with escort fighters unless absolutely necessary, and return home safely. Lydia's yak. One fighter was in perfect condition, armed with a 20mm cannon and 2 12.7mm machine guns. She had checked every system multiple times, studied weather reports and intelligence updates, and memorized the locations of friendly and enemy ground positions. As her engine warmed up on the flight line, she experienced a mixture of anticipation and terror that every combat pilot knows before their first encounter with enemy aircraft. The formation of 6 Soviet fighters took off at dawn, climbing toward an intercept course with the incoming German formation. Radio chatter was minimal and professional as pilots reported positions, weather conditions, and equipment status. Below them, the landscape showed the scars of advancing warfare: burning villages, destroyed bridges, and columns of refugees fleeing toward uncertain safety. First contact came at 15,000 feet as the Soviet formation spotted German bombers approaching from the northwest. There were 12 Heinkel He-111 bombers in tight formation, protected by 8 Messerschmitt fighters flying combat air patrol above and behind the bombers. The German formation was disciplined and experienced, maintaining precise positions while scanning continuously for intercepting fighters. Squadron leader Captain Alexei Solomatin led the Soviet formation in a climbing approach designed to attack the bombers from above while avoiding engagement with the escort fighters. The plan was textbook perfect: dive on the bombers with speed and altitude advantage, fire quick bursts to damage or destroy targets, then escape before the escorts could respond effectively. But combat rarely follows textbook plans. As the Soviet fighters began their attack dive,
German pilots spotted them and reacted with professional competence.
The escort fighters immediately moved to intercept while the bomber formation tightened up and began evasive maneuvers. Within seconds, the organized attack became a chaotic dogfight, with aircraft scattered across miles of airspace. Lydia found herself separated from the formation during the initial engagement, facing two Messerschmitt fighters that had positioned themselves between her and the bomber targets. Her training took over as she evaluated the tactical situation. She was outnumbered but had altitude advantage. Her aircraft was slightly less maneuverable but could outdive the German fighters, and her weapons had shorter range but higher hitting power than theirs.
The first Messerschmitt tacked with a diving pass from her left, its pilot confident that combat experience would overcome whatever skills this unknown Soviet pilot possessed. Lydia waited until the German fighter committed to its attack run, then rolled inverted and pulled into a split-S maneuver that reversed her direction while maintaining airspeed. The German pilot found himself overshooting his target, unable to bring his weapons to bear. As the Messerschmitt flashed past her cockpit, Lydia pulled hard on the stick to bring her nose around toward the second German fighter. The G-forces pressed her down into her seat and grayed out her vision temporarily, but her training held, and she maintained control throughout the maneuver. When her vision cleared, she had a perfect deflection shot at the second Messerschmitt as it tried to assist its wingman.
Her first burst of cannon fire in combat was devastatingly accurate. The 20 shells struck the German fighter's engine compartment and left wing, causing immediate fires and structural damage.
The Messerschmitt rolled over and began a smoking dive toward the ground below, its pilot bailing out as flames spread throughout the aircraft. Lydia had achieved her first aerial victory less than 10 minutes into her first combat mission.
But there was no time for celebration. The first German fighter had recovered from its overshoot and was now attacking from behind, its pilot no longer underestimating his opponent.
Cannon shells and machine gun bullets cracked past Lydia's cockpit as she twisted and turned to avoid the lethal stream of fire. Her aircraft shuddered from hits that punched holes in wings and fuselage without striking vital systems. The dogfight continued for several minutes that felt like hours, with both aircraft maneuvering desperately for killing positions while trying to avoid fatal mistakes.
Lydia's superior training and natural abilities gradually gave her an advantage, as the German pilot became increasingly frustrated and began making aggressive moves that left him vulnerable to counterattack. The decisive moment came when the German fighter attempted a head-on pass, betting that his experience and courage would unnerve the Soviet pilot into breaking off first. Instead, Lydia held her course steady and opened fire at maximum range, walking her shells along the German fighter's fuselage as it approached head-on. The Messerschmitt's cockpit disappeared in a shower of glass and metal as cannon shells found their mark, and the aircraft rolled over and crashed into a wheat field below.
2 victories in her first combat mission was unprecedented for any pilot, male or female. When Lydia returned to base and reported her achievements, the initial reaction was skepticism, followed by careful verification of her claims. Other pilots had observed portions of the engagement, and crashed aircraft were located by ground forces and confirmed as destroyed by enemy action. The news spread quickly through the regiment and beyond. A 21-year-old woman had not only survived her first combat mission but had achieved multiple victories against experienced German pilots. The male pilots who had been so hostile toward the women suddenly found themselves forced to reconsider their assumptions about female combat effectiveness. But Lydia's success came with a price that became apparent in the days following her first victories. Combat flying produced psychological effects that civilian aviation never approached. The adrenaline rush of aerial combat was followed by emotional crashes that left pilots exhausted and depressed. Sleep became difficult as pilots relived dogfights in their dreams, analyzing split-second decisions and imagining alternative outcomes. More disturbing was the realization that she had killed 2 human beings. During combat, enemy aircraft were simply targets to be destroyed, problems to be solved through application of tactical skill and weapons. After landing, they became people with families, dreams, and lives that had ended because of her actions. Some combat pilots never struggled with this psychological burden, but others found it increasingly difficult to bear. Lydia discovered she belonged to the first category. The knowledge that she had killed enemy pilots troubled her less than she had expected. They had been trying to kill her and her comrades, attacking targets that supported the German invasion of her homeland. Her actions had been necessary, effective, and tactically sound. If similar situations arose, she would respond the same way without hesitation. This realization was both liberating and disturbing. Combat effectiveness required a certain emotional detachment that allowed pilots to kill efficiently without being paralyzed by moral considerations.
But this same detachment made it difficult to maintain normal human relationships and emotional connections. Many combat pilots became increasingly isolated as their war experiences separated them from people who could not understand what they had endured.
Over the following weeks, Lydia flew missions almost daily as German forces approached Stalingrad and air combat intensified dramatically.
Each mission brought new challenges, different enemy aircraft types, varying weather conditions, evolving tactical situations that required split-second adaptations of learned procedures. Her victory count steadily increased as she demonstrated consistently superior combat performance. But victories came with losses that affected the entire regiment. Experienced pilots were shot down or failed to return from missions, their fates unknown.
Aircraft were destroyed by enemy action or mechanical failures, reducing the unit's operational strength. New replacement pilots arrived regularly, but most lacked the combat experience necessary to survive their first encounters with German fighters.
The psychological pressure of sustained combat operations began affecting everyone in the regiment. Pilots who had been confident and aggressive became cautious and defensive. Others responded by taking increasingly dangerous risks, pushing their aircraft and their skills beyond safe limits in pursuit of victory. A few suffered complete psychological breakdowns and had to be removed from flight duty. Lydia seemed immune to these pressures, maintaining consistent performance and emotional stability while others around her deteriorated. Her ability to compartmentalize combat stress and focus on mission requirements impressed veteran pilots who had struggled with similar challenges.
But her apparent invulnerability worried those who recognized that sustained combat operations eventually affected everyone. By autumn 1942, Lydia had achieved 8 confirmed aerial victories and earned promotion to senior lieutenant with command of her own flight of 4 aircraft.
Her tactical innovations and combat effectiveness had gained recognition from higher headquarters, and she was being mentioned in propaganda reports as an example of Soviet aviation superiority. But the war was intensifying around Stalingrad, and German forces were deploying their most experienced pilots and advanced aircraft to support the assault on the city.
The relatively easy victories of summer were ending, replaced by increasingly difficult encounters with elite enemy units equipped with improved fighters and tactics learned from 2 years of combat experience. The greatest test of Lydia's abilities was approaching, a series of aerial battles that would either establish her as one of history's greatest fighter pilots or end her career in flaming wreckage over the Stalingrad battlefields. October 1942 brought the kind of weather that made flying a nightmare in aerial combat nearly suicidal.
Low clouds hung over Stalingrad like gray wool. Visibility dropped to mere hundreds of yards, and icing conditions turned aircraft into flying death traps. German forces had reached the outskirts of the city, and every available aircraft was being thrown into the battle to prevent the complete collapse of Soviet resistance.
Lydia's regiment had been moved to a forward airfield barely 20 miles from the fighting, so close that artillery shells occasionally landed near the runway. The facilities were primitive even by wartime standards. Aircraft parked in hastily dug revetments, pilots sleeping in dugouts carved from frozen earth, and maintenance performed in the open despite enemy air attacks and deteriorating weather conditions. The tactical situation had changed dramatically since her early victories. German pilots in this sector were no longer the overconfident aviators she had first encountered. These were elite veterans of the elite Jagged Schwader 52, the highest-scoring fighter unit in aviation history. They flew the latest variants of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, equipped with improved engines, weapons, and armor that made them formidable opponents even for experienced Soviet pilots.
Leading this German formation was Hauptmann Erwin Clausen, an ace with 37 confirmed victories who had developed a personal interest in the Soviet female pilots after losing 2 wingmen to what intelligence reports described as an exceptionally skilled enemy aviator.
German monitoring of Soviet radio transmissions had identified a pilot referred to as the White Rose who was accumulating victories at an unprecedented rate. The nickname had originated from Lydia's habit of painting small white roses on her aircraft's nose after each aerial victory. She had started this practice as a private memorial to her childhood in peaceful times when roses grew in her mother's garden and war seemed impossibly distant. This symbol had evolved into a psychological weapon as German pilots began recognizing her aircraft and spreading stories about the deadly female pilot who marked her kills with flowers.
Intelligence officers on both sides were taking note of this unusual propaganda opportunity. For the Soviets, Lydia represented proof that their system could produce warriors superior to anything the supposedly advanced Germans could field. For the Germans, eliminating this symbolic figure would demonstrate the ultimate futility of Soviet resistance and the natural superiority of German military effectiveness. This personal dimension added dangerous complexity to what should have been purely tactical encounters.
Both sides were now fighting not just for military objectives, but for psychological victories that could affect morale throughout their respective forces. The anonymous nature of most aerial combat was replaced by a deadly game between identified opponents who understood that defeat meant more than death. It meant providing propaganda victories for enemy forces.
The confrontation that would test everything Lydia had learned came on a gray morning when German bombers attempted to destroy a crucial bridge over the Volga River. Soviet forces were using this bridge to supply defenders inside Stalingrad, and its destruction would effectively cut off thousands of troops fighting in the city's ruins.
The attack had to be stopped regardless of cost.
Lydia led a formation of 8 Soviet fighters against 20 German bombers, escorted by 16 of the best German fighter pilots available. The odds were terrible, but the mission was absolutely crucial.
If the bombers reached their target, Soviet resistance in Stalingrad might collapse within days, potentially changing the course of the entire war. The interception took place over the Volga River at 12,000 feet, with broken clouds providing concealment for both formations, but also creating opportunities for surprise attacks.
Lydia had positioned her fighters upsun from the German formation, using every tactical advantage available to maximize their chances against superior numbers. The initial attack was perfectly executed.
Soviet fighters dove from above and behind the German formation, achieving complete surprise and destroying 3 bombers before escort fighters could respond. But the German reaction was immediate and professional, with experienced pilots quickly organizing defensive formations while directing coordinated attacks against the Soviet interceptors.
Within minutes, the organized battle had deteriorated into multiple individual dogfights scattered across 20 miles of airspace. Aircraft climbed and dove through cloud layers, pursuing enemies or evading attacks with split-second maneuvering that pushed both pilots and machines to their absolute limits.
Radio communications became impossible as pilots concentrated on survival and target acquisition in the swirling aerial chaos. Lydia found herself engaged with 3 German fighters simultaneously, including Hauptmann Clausen's aircraft, which she recognized from intelligence briefings about his distinctive yellow nose markings.
The German formation attacked with textbook coordination, attempting to box her in with crossing attack patterns that would make evasive maneuvering impossible.
But Lydia had developed techniques during months of combat that confused even experienced enemy pilots. Instead of following standard evasive procedures, she flew her Yak-1 fighter in ways that seemed to violate basic principles of aerodynamics. She used her aircraft's structural strength to pull G-forces that would have caused other fighters to break apart, performed rolling maneuvers that bled energy in exchange for positioning advantages, and fired her weapons at ranges and angles that conventional gunnery training said were impossible. The first German fighter fell victim to a deflection shot that Clausen later described as impossible. A long-range burst that struck the aircraft's engine while both fighters were in vertical climbs pulling maximum G-forces. The second was destroyed when Lydia deliberately entered what appeared to be an unrecoverable flat spin, drawing the German pilot into a pursuit that became a killing opportunity when she recovered control at the last second and fired point-blank into his cockpit.
Clausen found himself alone against an opponent whose capabilities exceeded anything he had encountered in 3 years of combat flying. Every tactical manual he had studied, every technique he had mastered, every advantage his superior aircraft should have provided seemed useless against a pilot who fought with intuitive brilliance that transcended formal training. The duel between these 2 extraordinary pilots continued for nearly 20 minutes, with both aircraft damaged by cannon strikes and running low on fuel and ammunition. Neither could gain the decisive advantage necessary for a killing shot, and both were approaching the point where continuing the fight would result in crashes from fuel starvation regardless of combat outcome. The decisive moment came when Clausen attempted a head-on attack, betting that his aircraft's heavier armament would give him an advantage in a mutual firing pass. Lydia accepted the challenge but used a technique she had developed during training. She opened fire first at maximum range, then pulled into a vertical climb that took her above Clausen's return fire, while keeping her weapons trained on his aircraft. Her shell struck Clausen's Messerschmitt in the engine compartment and cockpit area, causing immediate fires and hydraulic failures that made the aircraft uncontrollable. The German ace bailed out over German-controlled territory, surviving with serious burns but alive to report that he had encountered the most skilled fighter pilot of his career. Lydia's victory over Clausen became her 10th confirmed aerial kill, but it came at enormous cost. Her aircraft had been hit multiple times during the prolonged dogfight, with damage to flight controls, engine cooling systems, and weapons that made it barely capable of returning to base. More seriously, cannon shell fragments had wounded her in the left shoulder and leg, causing blood loss and pain that made flying increasingly difficult. The return flight to her base became an endurance test that pushed her physical and mental capabilities beyond anything training had prepared her for.
Her aircraft was losing altitude steadily due to engine damage, forcing her to navigate by landmarks while staying below cloud cover in territory where German fighters might appear at any moment. Blood from her wounds was pooling in the cockpit, and shock from combat stress and physical trauma was making concentration increasingly difficult. Navigation became critical as fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels, and engine temperature climbed toward the red line that indicated imminent mechanical failure. Lydia had to find her airfield quickly or crash land in territory that might be controlled by advancing German ground forces. Pain from her wounds was making it difficult to maintain consciousness, and the aircraft's damaged controls required constant attention to prevent departure from controlled flight.
She found the airfield just as her engine began showing signs of complete failure, smoke pouring from the cooling vents and vibrations, indicating internal damage that would soon cause total breakdown. Her approach was too fast because damaged flaps wouldn't extend, and she had no choice but to attempt a straight-in landing with minimal control authority in an aircraft that wanted to roll inverted. A landing was barely controlled violence. Her Yak
1 hit the runway hard, bounced twice, then ground looped when the damaged landing gear collapsed. The aircraft came to rest inverted in a cloud of dust and scattered metal, fuel spreading across the ground in pools that could ignite from any spark or flame. Ground crews reached the wreckage within seconds, expecting to find another pilot killed by mechanical failure or combat damage. Instead, they found Lydia hanging upside down in her restraints, conscious but bleeding heavily from multiple wounds, still holding the control stick in a death grip that had to be pried loose by rescue personnel. The medical examination revealed wounds that should have been incapacitating but hadn't prevented her from flying a damaged aircraft home through enemy territory. Cannon shell fragments had penetrated her shoulder and leg, and she had lost enough blood to cause shock symptoms that would have rendered most pilots unconscious. But she had remained alert and functional long enough to complete her mission and return safely. Recovery took 3 weeks in a field hospital where she shared space with infantry soldiers wounded in the Stalingrad fighting. The experience of seeing ground combat casualties gave her new perspective on aerial warfare. Fighter pilots faced death in seconds during brief engagements, but infantry soldiers endured days or weeks of constant danger, with wounds that were often far more horrible than anything aviators experienced. When she returned to flight duty in November 1942, Lydia discovered that her reputation had grown far beyond her regiment. Soviet propaganda had seized on her story as proof of their system's superiority, while German intelligence had placed her on a list of high-priority targets whose elimination would provide significant psychological advantages. More importantly, her fellow pilots now regarded her with a mixture of respect and superstition that set her apart even from other successful aces. They recognized that they were serving with someone whose capabilities exceeded normal human limits, a pilot who seemed immune to the fears and limitations that affected everyone else.
But they also worried about what sustained combat was doing to her psychologically and whether her apparent invulnerability might lead to overconfidence that could prove fatal. Lydia was about to face the greatest test of her career, a series of aerial battles that would either establish her as the greatest female fighter pilot in history or end her life in the frozen skies above Stalingrad. The war was approaching its climax, and every pilot knew that the coming battles would determine not just their personal survival but the fate of their entire nation. January 1943 marked the beginning of the final phase of the Battle of Stalingrad, and the aerial warfare above the frozen city had reached levels of intensity that pushed both pilots and aircraft beyond their design limits.
The German Sixth Army was trapped inside the city, desperate for air support and supply drops, while Soviet forces were determined to eliminate the surrounded troops and prove their air force could compete with the supposedly superior Luftwaffe. Lydia had returned to combat flying with 12 confirmed aerial victories, a Hero of the Soviet Union medal, and a reputation that extended far beyond military circles.
Soviet newspapers carried stories about the White Rose of Stalingrad, describing her as a symbol of feminine courage and communist determination. German intelligence had issued specific orders regarding her capture or elimination, recognizing that her continued success was undermining their propaganda about Slavic racial inferiority.
But fame came with pressures that threatened to destroy the psychological balance that had made her such an effective combat pilot. Military officials demanded that she participate in propaganda events, give interviews to foreign correspondents, and pose for photographs that could be used to encourage other women to join military service.
These activities took time away from training and maintenance while forcing her to present a public persona that bore little resemblance to the complex reality of her combat experience. More dangerous was the way her reputation affected tactical decision-making. Soviet commanders began assigning her to missions where political considerations outweighed military necessity, hoping that her presence would guarantee success or provide propaganda victories even if objectives were not achieved. German forces were specifically targeting formations known to include female pilots, bringing their best pilots and aircraft to bear whenever intelligence indicated she might be flying. The psychological pressure was manifesting in ways that worried those who knew her best.
Lydia had become increasingly isolated, spending hours alone studying enemy aircraft manuals and developing tactical theories that pushed conventional fighter doctrine beyond recognized limits. She showed signs of the combat fatigue that affected all pilots after extended exposure to aerial warfare: difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, emotional detachment from colleagues and friends.
Her aircraft had also been modified in ways that reflected her evolving approach to aerial combat. Extra armor had been installed around the cockpit area despite the weight penalty this imposed on performance. Additional ammunition storage increased her firepower at the cost of fuel capacity and maneuverability. Most significantly, she had requested removal of her radio equipment, arguing that communications were a distraction during combat and that she could be more effective operating independently.
This last modification worried her squadron commander, Major Dmitry Popkov, who recognized the signs of a pilot becoming too aggressive and independent for effective unit operations. Combat pilots needed to maintain tactical discipline and follow orders, even when their individual capabilities exceeded those of their colleagues.
Lone wolves might achieve impressive individual scores, but they could also compromise unit effectiveness and endanger other pilots through unpredictable behavior. The mission that would test all these concerns came on January 28, 1943, when German forces launched a coordinated air attack designed to break Soviet supply lines supporting the final assault on the trapped Sixth Army. Intelligence indicated that the German formation would include their most experienced pilots flying advanced variants of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 fighters, making this encounter potentially the most challenging of the war. Soviet planning assigned Lydia to lead a formation of 6 fighters tasked with intercepting German bombers before they could reach their targets. Her orders were specific: engage the bombers, avoid prolonged combat with escort fighters, and return home safely. The mission was tactically sound and well within the capabilities of her formation, but it required strict adherence to planned procedures and careful coordination between aircraft. Weather conditions on the morning of the mission were marginal, with low clouds, poor visibility, and icing that made flying dangerous even without enemy opposition. Several other missions had been canceled due to weather, but the importance of stopping the German bombing attack overrode safety concerns. Aircraft would have to operate individually or in pairs rather than large formations, increasing the difficulty of mutual support and coordination. Lydia's formation took off before dawn, climbing through thick clouds toward an intercept course with the approaching German force. Radio communications were disrupted by atmospheric conditions, making coordination almost impossible, and forcing each pilot to navigate independently while trying to maintain formation integrity. Ice began forming on aircraft surfaces almost immediately, adding weight and reducing control effectiveness. First contact with enemy aircraft came at 8,000 feet as the Soviet formation broke through the cloud cover into clear air above the overcast layer. Below them, spread across several miles of airspace, were 30 German aircraft, 18 bombers, escorted by 12 of the most advanced fighters available to the Luftwaffe. The German formation was perfectly organized despite weather conditions, demonstrating the professional competence that had made them so successful throughout the war. Lydia's tactical analysis was immediate and accurate. Her 6 fighters were outnumbered 5-1 by an enemy force that included pilots and aircraft superior to anything she had previously encountered. Standard doctrine called for her to radio for reinforcements and avoid engagement until additional Soviet fighters arrived. Instead, she ordered her formation to attack immediately, before the German bombers could reach their targets. The decision violated her orders and military doctrine, but it reflected Lydia's understanding that sometimes standard procedures were inadequate for extraordinary situations. The German bombing attack would succeed if not stopped immediately, potentially affecting the outcome of the entire Stalingrad battle. Her formation represented the only immediate threat to enemy success, making engagement necessary regardless of odds or survival probability. Her attack was launched from a position that should have been tactically impossible, directly into the sun, from below the German formation, against an enemy that outnumbered her force by 5-1. But Lydia had calculated that surprise and aggressive tactics could overcome numerical disadvantage if executed with perfect precision and absolute commitment to success.
The initial diving attack destroyed 2 German bombers before escort fighters could respond, but it also scattered her formation and left each Soviet aircraft engaged in individual combat against multiple enemies. Within minutes, 3 of her wingmen had been shot down or forced to disengage with damaged aircraft, leaving Lydia and her remaining pilots fighting desperately against overwhelming odds.
The aerial battle that followed became the stuff of legend among pilots on both sides. Lydia engaged multiple enemy aircraft simultaneously,
using tactics that seemed to defy basic principles of physics and aerodynamics.
She flew her Yak, one fighter beyond its design limitations, pulling G-forces that should have caused structural failure, while maintaining weapons accuracy that veteran German pilots later described as supernatural. Over the course of 40 minutes, she destroyed 4 additional German aircraft while dodging attacks from 8 or more enemy fighters that were trying to corner and eliminate her. Her aircraft absorbed damage that should have made it unflyable: cannon shells through both wings, machine gun bullets in the engine compartment, and control surfaces damaged to the point where normal maneuvering became almost impossible. But the physical damage to her aircraft was nothing compared to the wounds she was accumulating. Cannon shell fragments had penetrated the cockpit armor, causing injuries to her chest and arms that were bleeding heavily, and affecting her ability to manipulate flight controls. More seriously, a bullet had grazed her head, causing vision problems and intermittent loss of consciousness that made sustained combat increasingly dangerous. The German pilots recognized they were fighting someone whose capabilities exceeded anything they had encountered, but they also saw that she was wounded and her aircraft was failing. Their attacks became increasingly coordinated and aggressive as they attempted to finish an opponent who should already have been dead but continued fighting with determination that bordered on the supernatural. The decisive moment came when Lydia attempted to engage a formation of German bombers that had reorganized after her initial attack. Her damaged aircraft could barely maintain level flight, her wounds were affecting her vision and coordination, and fuel gauges showed levels that made return to base questionable, even if combat ended immediately.
But she pressed the attack anyway, diving on the bomber formation with weapons blazing despite fire from multiple escort fighters that were converging on her position. Her final burst of cannon fire destroyed 1 more enemy bomber, bringing her total aerial victories to 12 confirmed kills and establishing her as one of the highest-scoring female pilots in aviation history.
The cost of this final victory was immediate and devastating. Multiple German fighters fired on her aircraft simultaneously, their combined fire causing catastrophic damage that made continued flight impossible.
Her engine caught fire, control cables were severed, and the aircraft began an unrecoverable dive toward the frozen landscape below. Lydia's attempt to bail out was complicated by wounds that had weakened her physically and damage to her cockpit that made escape difficult.
She managed to jettison the canopy and release her restraints, but by then her aircraft was diving too fast and too low for a successful parachute jump. Witnesses on the ground reported seeing a figure falling from the burning fighter, but no parachute was observed.
The crash site was located 3 days later by Soviet ground forces advancing through territory recently liberated from German control. Lydia's body was found in the wreckage of her aircraft, surrounded by evidence of the incredible damage she had inflicted on enemy forces during her final mission. Nearby were the remains of 2 German aircraft she had destroyed in her last combat, proving that she had continued fighting effectively even while mortally wounded. Investigation of the wreck revealed modifications to her aircraft that demonstrated her evolution from trained pilot to tactical innovator. Extra armor plating had been installed in critical areas, weapons had been modified for increased rate of fire, and ammunition storage had been expanded to support extended combat operations. Most significantly, her aircraft carried detailed notes documenting tactical innovations she had developed through months of combat experience. The final count of her achievements was unprecedented for any pilot, male or female, in such a short combat career. 12 confirmed aerial victories, numerous probable kills, and tactical innovations that influenced fighter doctrine for the remainder of the war. But statistics could not capture the psychological impact of her achievements on both Soviet and German forces, or the inspiration she provided to countless women who saw military service as a path to equality and recognition. Soviet propaganda made her death into a symbol of heroic sacrifice, but the reality was more complex. Lydia had pushed herself and her aircraft beyond safe limits in pursuit of victory, demonstrating both the potential and the dangers of exceptional individual achievement in modern warfare.
Her story became a cautionary tale about the psychological pressures of sustained combat and the price of pursuing perfection in an inherently imperfect environment. German intelligence reports filed after her death acknowledged that they had been fighting one of the most skilled pilots either side had produced during the war.
Enemy pilots who had engaged her in combat described encounters with someone whose capabilities seemed to transcend normal human limitations, and several recommended that her tactics be studied and incorporated into their own training programs. The woman who had once been told that flying was too dangerous for females had proven that courage, skill, and determination could overcome any prejudice or limitation.
Her 12 aerial victories represented not just military success but social revolution, demonstrating that women could excel at the most demanding and dangerous occupations if given opportunity and proper training. But her greatest achievement was not the aircraft she destroyed or the awards she received. It was the door she opened for future generations of women who would follow her example into aviation, space exploration, and countless other fields previously considered exclusively male domains.
The shy girl who had watched aircraft cross the sky above her hometown had become a legend whose influence would extend far beyond her short but extraordinary combat career. In the end, Lydia Litviak had accomplished exactly what she set out to prove, that the sky belongs to anyone brave enough and skilled enough to claim it.
Her blood-stained cockpit and bullet-riddled aircraft had become symbols of what was possible when prejudice was overcome by performance, when determination transcended limitation, and when individual courage changed the course of history itself.
Told she couldn't fly, she shot down 12 enemy jets and returned bleeding but victorious.